The auctioneer had spent 3 whole minutes trying to give away an airplane, and 300 people standing in a June wheat stubble field would not raise him a single dollar. And that is how Emmett Rourke came to own a piece of American history for $40. It was the second Saturday of June, 1957, at the Halstead dispersal south of Ashfield in Prewitt County, Kansas. Ivor Halstead had farmed that section for 51 years and left no family nearer than a nephew in Wichita. And the nephew had hired Dale Purdy to sell every last thing on the place in one long day. The tractor, the combine, the shop tools, the parlor furniture, and the long, low shape that had stood under a canvas tarp at the back of the machine shed since before the war. 2 ringmen rolled it out into the light on a flat hay wagon and pulled the canvas back. And Dale Purdy's chant, which had not stopped rolling since 8 that morning, stopped. It was an airplane. A high-wing monoplane, or most of one, a fuselage of steel tube and yellowed fabric, maybe 24 feet long, one wing still bolted to the cabin and the other lying beside it on the wagon boards. A big 9-cylinder radial engine gone the brown-black of a cold stove at the nose, and a laminated wooden propeller with one tip split back like a cedar shingle. It sat there in the sun looking less like a flying machine than like the picked clean bones of one. One aeroplane, Dale Purdy said, and you could hear him decide not to guess at the make. Genuine antique. Be a fine project for the right kind of fellow. The field looked at it the way a field looks at a thing it has already made up its mind about. And then a man in a mustard-tanned sport coat up from the city and standing a head taller than the farmers on top of a hay bale gave the crowd its verdict and saved everybody the trouble of forming one. Vern Tolliver bought and sold old aircraft out of a hangar in Kansas City, and he had driven 200 miles on the strength of a party line rumor, and one slow walk around the wagon had soured him. He told the men near enough to hear that they were looking at a cobbled-up fake, 3 wrecks married into one. The front cockpit was gone. Somebody had cut the whole forward seat out and riveted an ugly slab-sided fuel tank into the hole. The wing struts were doubled, 2 skinny ones where the factory put one, the mark of a nervous amateur. Down the left side ran a long ripple of scorch and clumsy patching where the fabric had once caught fire and been sewn back over in a hurry. And along one flank of the cowl a bulge had been hand-beaten to clear something that matched no factory drawing on earth. That, Vern Tolliver said, loud enough to carry to the back rows, is rag and rusted tube. It is $40 of scrap aluminum and stove wood, and you would cry the whole way home loading it. Nobody argued with him, because he sold airplanes for a living. And the rest of them raised hogs and wheat. Dale Purdy opened at $100 and got the wind. He came down to 50 to 25 and finally asked for a single dollar just to get the thing moving, and the field gave him a laugh instead of a bid. That was when Emmett Rourke put his hand up. He was 46 years old, and he farmed a half section of wheat and Milo east of Ashfield. And before any of that, he had spent the whole of the war as an engine mechanic on a bomber field in England, 3 years with his arms buried to the shoulder in 9-cylinder radial engines exactly like the cold brown lump on the nose of that wagon. He had come to the Halstead place at 6 that morning before the crowd, the way he came to every farm sale within driving distance, and had stood in front of the airplane in the half-dark with a flashlight, and somewhere in those 10 minutes the back of his neck had gone cold and stayed that way. He did not tell the field why. He raised 2 fingers. $40, Dale Purdy said, and then said it again because it had knocked him out of his rhythm. I am bid $40. Do I hear 50 anywhere in the crowd? Up on his hay bale, Vern Tolliver laughed and waved the back of his hand at the wagon the way a man waves off a fly. Sold, Purdy said. For $40 to Emmett Rourke, who has just bought himself an airplane and a hernia in the same afternoon. The crowd liked that better than anything else Dale Purdy said all day. Emmett walked up through the laughing, took the little pencil paper ticket, folded it once, and laid his open hand flat on the cold braids of the propeller for a second or two longer than he needed to, the way another man lays a hand on the neck of a horse he has decided to bring home. If you've made it this far into Emmett's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Here is what Emmett Rourke had seen in the dark that not one other person on that farm had thought to go looking for. He had put his flashlight on the ugly slab-sided tank that filled the place where the front seat belonged and seen at once that it was not a butcher job at all. It was some of the finest sheet metal work he had ever laid eyes on. Seams hand-rolled and double riveted, the whole tank swaged to follow the exact curve of the fuselage. Built by a man who had a whole winter to do it and a powerful reason to want every last gallon he could carry aloft. You do not build a tank like that to fly to the next county for a barn dance. You build a tank like that to fly somewhere with no field waiting at the far end, nowhere to set down if the gasoline runs out before the land does. And then he had moved the light 6 inches to the burn scar down the left side, and he had known whose airplane he was standing in front of, and it was the knowing that had turned his neck cold. Every wheat county in Kansas has a flyer buried somewhere in it, a man who came home from the First War with a taste for engines and a war surplus biplane and spent the whole of the 20s hopping pastures at $2 a ride. Prewitt County had Wendell Marsh. He barnstormed the little towns up and down the Ashfield line, carrying the brave ones aloft for the price of a bushel of wheat. He flew the first crop dusting that anybody in that country had ever seen done from the air, out of a hopper he had cut and riveted himself. And in the winters, in a rented shed behind the Ashfield grain elevator, he built an airplane of his own out of steel tube and spruce and fabric and a radial engine he had torn down and rebuilt twice. What Wendell Marsh meant to do with that airplane, nobody around Ashfield took the least bit seriously until the week he had gone and done it. In the early spring of 1929, he flew his home-built monoplane out of a stubble pasture south of town at first light and did not come down again for better than 1,600 miles, non-stop to the far coast and then 100 miles up it. To prove a thing he cared about a great deal more than he cared about money, which was that an airplane built in a shed by a wheat country mechanic could go as far as any factory ship in the country. He carried no radio and no parachute, a jug of water, a sack of sandwiches, and a hand-built tank of gasoline where his front seat used to be. Somewhere over the mountains in the dark, an oil line let go, and the hot oil found the exhaust stack, and the whole left side of the fuselage began to burn, and Wendell Marsh slipped the airplane hard over on one wing to hold the flame off the fabric and out of the slipstream, and beat at the fire through the open side window with a folded canvas coat. One hand flying the ship and one hand fighting the fire, and he came down at the coast at dawn with the left side of his airplane scorched black to the tube and a world-distance record sitting in his lap. And then the record was taken away from him, and the way it was taken is the whole reason a national treasure spent 25 years under a canvas tarp in Ivor Halstad's machine shed. Wendell Marsh landed at the coast with nobody at all waiting for him, because he was a proud and private man who had told no one important that he was coming, and he had not a dollar to make a noise about it afterward. 9 days later, a well-financed pilot named Cabot Frayne flew a factory-built monoplane a little farther up that same coast. With 3 big newspapers behind him and a company painting its name down the side of his cowl, and the country handed Cabot Frayne the distance record and a ticker tape parade, and a single paragraph about the Kansas mechanic who had flown farther first ran once in the Ashfield Clarion and was never picked up anywhere. Marsh had no photograph that a city editor would run, no witnesses with titles after their names, and an airplane too badly scorched to roll out in front of a newsreel camera. So he came home. He traded the ship to Ivar Hallstad in the fall of 1932 for a team of mules and the forgiveness of a feed bill, and he flew the mail and dusted crops until his eyes finally failed him, and he was buried at the age of Ashfield in the spring of 1951 under a flat gray stone that carried his name and 2 dates, and not one single word about any record. Emmett Rourke had grown up hearing the Marsh flight told across the counter at the elevator and around the stove at the pool hall, and like most of Prewitt County, he had it half filed away with the tall tales, the catfish the size of hogs, and the hail that killed the mule. But Emmett had spent 3 years of his life learning the exact difference between a wreck and a repair. And he knew a thing the pool hall did not, which is that a fabric airplane that has had a fire down one whole side and then been patched and flown all the way home afterward does not look like a crash. It looks like precisely the long, scorched shape that had been sitting on Dale Purdy's hay wagon in the sun while a man from Kansas City called it firewood. Getting it home cost him a good deal more than he had paid to buy it. A neighbor's flatbed and a borrowed loader and the better part of a Sunday put him $32 into an airplane he had bought for $40. And Ada Rourke wrote both figures in the farm book without a word about the arithmetic, which Emmett understood to be a kindness. And then asked him across the supper table what exactly he thought he had dragged into their machine shed. "I think it is Wendell Marsh's airplane," he said. Ada set down her fork. Ada Rourke had taught the Ashfield school for 20 years before she married him, and she had kept a schoolteacher's memory, and she said that if that were true, then half of everything the county had ever said about Wendell Marsh was true after all, and the other half was owed to him and had been owed to him for a long time. Then she asked the only question that finally mattered, which was how on earth a man was ever going to prove a thing like that about a pile of rag and rusted tube. And it was the very question that would nearly sink the whole business 2 months later. Emmett worked at it the slow way all that summer, in the evenings after the wheat was cut and hauled. He would not put a wire brush to the fabric or a grinder to the scar. He cleaned it an inch at a time with a rag and mineral spirits and a good light. He found under the doubled struts that the second strut on each side was no amateur's nerves at all, but a careful reinforcement to carry the weight of a full load of fuel that a factory wing was never designed to lift. He found that the hand-beaten bulge in the cowl was a housing formed by hand to clear an oversized oil cooler. The exact thing a man adds when he means to run one engine wide open for a day and a night without ever shutting it down. Every last feature that Vern Tolliver had read at a glance as the fumbling of a bungler was, when you turned it over slowly in a good light, the careful work of a man solving one by one the precise problems that a 1,600-mile flight was going to hand him. Then Emmett drove clear across 2 counties to the county home and wheeled a very old man out into the sun. Alvin Skoglund was 84 years old, and he had been Wendell Marsh's ground man through the whole of the 20s, the young fellow who swung the propeller and doped the fabric and mixed the paint in the freezing shed behind the elevator. He was mostly blind now, and his hands shook on the arms of the chair, but Emmett had brought a close photograph of the strut fitting, the little bracket that tied the doubled struts to the frame of the fuselage, and he took the old man's shaking fingers and laid them on the picture. Alvin Skoglund went completely still. He said that he had filed that very bracket himself out of a scrapped automobile axle over 3 cold evenings in the winter of 1928, because Wendell would not spend the money on a proper forging, and that if Emmett would look on the underside of it, he would find the place where the file had slipped in the cold and Alvin had cursed and cut a little half-moon nick that he had never afterward been able to hide. Emmett had already found the half-moon nick. He simply had not known what it was until a man of 84 told him across a photograph. That should have been the end of it, and the beginning of the good part. Instead, it was very nearly the end of it in the other direction. Because when Emmett finally sat down and wrote a careful letter to the National Aeronautics Museum in Washington, and a curator wrote back and then came out on the train, the curator arrived carrying the one thing that nobody in Prewitt County had ever had in front of them, the printed record. And the printed record, the single serious account of the Marsh flight that had survived at all. A paragraph in a 1930 aviation yearbook ended with a line that stopped Emmett Rourke's heart flat in his chest. It said that Wendell Marsh's home-built monoplane had been so badly burned during the flight that it was scrapped at the coast in 1929 and never flew again. Scrapped at the coast, never flew again. In print, in ink, in the only book in the world that so much as mentioned the flight. The curator was a decent and careful man, and he was kind about it, but he said the thing that a careful man is required to say, that if the ship was cut up in California in 1929, then whatever was sitting in Emmett's machine shed was, at the very best, a different airplane wearing a similar wound, and at the worst, it was exactly the married-up fake the dealer had called it in front of 300 people. He had watched it happen before, he said. A man wants a thing to be true so badly that he builds the truth for himself out of coincidence and hope. Emmett Rourke did not sleep the better part of 2 nights, and on the 3rd evening, the same fact that had sunk him turned all the way over and became the thing that saved it, and it was Ada who turned it over, standing at the shed door with her coat still buttoned. They printed that it was scrapped, she said, because that is what a proud man tells a newspaper when he is broke and ashamed and cannot bear the whole country watching him fail to raise the money for a comeback. Nobody at that coast ever laid eyes on it cut up. They saw it burn, and they saw him leave. And a reporter wrote down the easy end of the story. She looked a long moment at the scar running the length of the fuselage. It was never scrapped at all. He patched it in a rented hangar with his own 2 hands and flew it home the slow way, a few 100 miles at a hop, and he put it in Ivar Halstad's shed so that he would never again have to look at it. And everybody printed scrapped, because scrapped was an easier word than the truth. And the proof of it, in the end, was the scar itself. The curator, once he stopped trying to disqualify the airplane and started instead to read it, laid a magnifier along the burned side and found that the fire had been fought from the inside and beaten while the airplane was moving. The scorch ran heaviest low and forward at the cowl and feathered out thin toward the tail, exactly the way a flame streams backward when a ship is slipping hard sideways through the air at speed, and nothing at all like the way a parked machine burns straight up where it stands. You cannot fake the direction of a fire. That airplane had been a light in flight, moving fast, with a living man holding it over on one wing to save the fabric. The wound that the dealer had held up as the proof of a fake was the one mark on the whole airplane that could not, by any hand, have been faked. After that, the last of it came quickly. The museum laid the scar and the tank and the doubled struts and the hand-formed cowl against a single grainy photograph that the Ashfield Clarion had run one time in 1929. A picture of a scorched monoplane standing on a California field at dawn with a thin, exhausted man in a leather coat under the wing, and every line of the airplane agreed with the picture. Cabot Frayn's celebrated record ship had been photographed 100 times from every angle and had never once worn a burn, because Cabot Frayn had never flown through a fire in his life. The mocked, butchered, scorched wreck on Emmett Rourke's hay wagon was the only airplane left on the earth that matched the photograph, and the photograph was 28 years old. And together they proved that a wheat country mechanic in a machine he had built with his own hands had flown farther than any man then alive, 9 full days before the country pinned the honor on somebody with a bankroll. Vern Tolliver, who had called it rag and rusted tube in front of the whole county, telephoned the Rourke place twice that winter. The first time he offered $2,000 for the wreck he had appraised out loud at $40 of scrap. The second time, after the museum's letter had gotten around, he offered $9,000 and then $18,000 in the same breath, and told Emmett he was a plain fool to sit on a thing like that. Emmett Rourke thanked him kindly for calling and set the telephone back on its hook both times, gently, the way he did every other thing. He did not sell the airplane to Vern Tolliver, and he did not sell it to the collector who drove up from Denver in the spring with a checkbook and an offer that would have paid off the whole half-section twice over and bought a new tractor besides. He gave it instead to the National Aeronautics Museum in Washington for the price of $1, on 3 conditions written out plainly in Ada's schoolteacher hand: that the airplane be shown standing and whole, exactly as it had come home, scar and all, and never painted or prettied or made to look like new; that the card beside it carry the name of Wendell Marsh, and the true season, the early spring of 1929, and the true distance, and the one plain word first; and that a second card, right next to it, carry the name of Alvin Skoglund, who had filed a bracket out of a junk axle on 3 cold winter nights and swung the propeller on the gray morning the airplane left the ground. The museum agreed to every word of it. There is a marker now on the flat gray stone at the edge of Ashfield, set there by the county the following year, that says at last what the stone had left out for 6 years: that the man lying under it flew farther than anyone in the world in an airplane he had built with his own hands, and that he did it first. Alvin Skoglund lived long enough to be taken to Washington on the train and to see the airplane stood up on its own wheels behind a rope, and before they closed the rope he reached out and laid his shaking hand flat on the propeller hub, in the very place Emmett had laid his at the auction, and he told the curator that the hub wanted a quarter turn of grease and always had. And Emmett Rourke went home to Kansas and back to his wheat. He kept the little penciled auction ticket folded in the family Bible, the one that says $40 in Dale Purdy's own hand, because Ada told him that a man ought to keep the receipt for the best thing he ever did, even when the best thing he ever did was to come early and to look in the half-dark at a machine that 300 people had already agreed was worthless, and to see in it a whole entire life that the rest of the world had quietly agreed to forget. So there is a right way to walk a farm sale, and Emmett Rourke knew it, and it is this. Come early, before the crowd gathers and the loud man on the hay bale has told everybody what a thing is worth. Walk out to the back of the shed in the half-dark all by yourself. Put your flat open hand on the cold iron of whatever the county has already decided is nothing but rag and rusted tube, and then look hard at the scars on it as though they were handwriting, because that is exactly what they are, and once in a great while, if you have spent your one short life learning how to read them, they will tell you that you are standing there in the dark with your hand resting on a thing that a man once held sideways through a fire, alone over the mountains before the sun, to prove that the place he came from was worth something after all.